a self-taught, multidisciplinary artist whose work experiments with many languages, art forms, and genres to search out and dwell with the dualities, gray areas, and forms of hybridity that resonate with her own experience of inhabiting a self that exists across multiple languages and these competing and conflicting cultural histories. She's currently based in Montreal and has exhibited across Canada and across the globe. Her short film, Mobilize, takes you on a feverish, exhilarating journey from the far north to the urban south, and her more recent video installation, Transatlantic, takes us on an immersive and disruptive trip across the colonial route of the Atlantic Ocean. She's currently in post-production on her first feature-length narrative film, Bootlegger, which won Best Screenplay at Cannes Cinefondation in 2017 and has just been picked up by an international distributor. The film is a community-oriented engagement with ideas of self-determination, finding a cohesive sense of self in a world of borders, and the sort of individual and collective resilience required to endure through trauma. In this interview, she talks about how the pandemic has influenced the way she thinks about producing art, and how returning to her original, more improvisational approach to creating allows her to produce with the greatest amount of self-assurance and freedom. To begin with, I wanted to talk about, in a sense, how active you are on, Instagram, on social media, in using these platforms to give people access to the work that you're currently doing in your process. One of the things that you note on Instagram is that you really feel lucky right now that you're able to continue working during these pandemic times. And I kind of wanted to use that as a means of asking you, what kinds of challenges you've faced working in Montreal, in the studio during the pandemic. What has sort of changed, how your daily practice today is different than it's been in the past? Have all the challenges been just difficult, or are there kind of productive things that have come out of having to shift the way you work in the context of the pandemic?
It's been definitely an interesting time for me, this pandemic. I see it as a cycle. I was coming out of a very busy cycle of production and presentation of my work, and I guess I was working at a very rapid, fast-paced rhythm, and so when the pandemic hit, it was almost a moment for me to take a step back and to because everything was locked down for 3 months. It was a time of really just stopping for a moment, and it was quite beneficial for me because I think I needed that break. It was a time for me to just get some rest a little bit and start thinking about what type of work that I wanted to make, instead of just catching up on production and catching up to the next exhibition and the next trip or the next film festival. So it was I was quite. For me, it was a beneficial moment where I could just focus on what is it that I'm trying to do with the work, and what is it I'm trying to say, and where's the work going. It was also trying to adapt the work in a different way. It was a time for me to really focus on research. I started reading a lot more, something I didn't really have time to do before. And before I was only reading, for research, specific to the works I was doing, or like specific to moments in time and exhibitions. But at this time, I could start branching out. So that also meant opening up to new ideas and trying to branch out to new possibilities for the work in the future. So I would say, in general, it allowed me to start thinking much more ahead, which is a bit contradictory with the pandemic, where everything stopped and no one could really think about the future. We couldn't make plans, but in my case, and I'm just talking about the work, I could start thinking about new ideas of what I wanted to explore within the work.
That sounds pretty exciting. That work of reevaluating, I kind of wanted to, I guess, start kind of rewind and start at the beginning, and sort of, you say that you're sort of adapting the type of work that you do. I've noticed that you talk about the fact that your art, the work that you do, doesn't necessarily come from a place of sort of like rigorous, like formal training.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because Heather Igliolorti, the
Yes.
curator at the you probably know this person. My French is terrible. I'm not bilingual. I apologize. In Montreal, she talks about how it's often claimed that indigenous languages don't have a word for art or artist,
Mhm.
and she says that like that is mainly because art is a part of everything that indigenous folks do in community, and it's like a part of it's not reducible to a singular concept, she says,
Absolutely. It's embedded in everything that we do.
which is different obviously from the very kind of classified way in which art as a profession is sometimes understood in sort of Eurocentric ways. um, and we can even maybe relate this to one of the apparently the translated meanings of Anishinaabe.
Mhm.
There's an Ojibwe historian, Basil Johnston, who talks about how one of the term's literal translations is beings made out of nothing, or spontaneous beings. Um, and so it's clearly there's like this improvisational quality. The way that, for example, you put together your short film Mobilize shows that kind of improvisational quality that your art has. Um, to what extent do you think that your art, the propulsive nature of a film like Mobilize, comes from the fact that you didn't actually, as you say, come from an artistically driven family, and you didn't actually have that formal academic training? Do you think that's something that frees you up to create in these more improvisational ways?
Absolutely. And I think from the beginning, I mean, I started making art in a very spontaneous way. I picked up a camera and made a short film. The first film I made was titled Ikwe, which means woman in the Anishinaabe language. And I did it in my living room all by myself. And it came from a very spontaneous urge to want to express myself. And I feel when I create work in a spontaneous way, it's often the most liberating type of work that I make. It's where I doubt myself the less. It's where I have the most fun as well. So as years pass by, I always try to go back to that initial spontaneity that allows me to create without any rules or any barriers or any self doubt. Um, Sometimes when you have bigger frames or bigger budgets, or you start putting pressure on yourself to create an exhibition or a film, you start losing that kind of spontaneous raw way of creating. And it's not that it's bad, it's just it's fun to have these projects along the way that remind you why you create in the first place, and that kind of instinctive urge to create, and that ideas that are flowing very naturally.
Yeah, I imagine so, right? There's a different kind of pressure, time pressures, financial pressures that don't exist necessarily. And one of the things that I saw online, there's this short video from, I think it's like RBC on emerging artists, where you talk about how art shouldn't just be beautiful.
Yes.
And I see a kind of a trajectory in your work from Ikwe, which is such a beautiful short film, to films that are more unnerving in a way, that inspire this kind of sublime uneasiness. You seem to be more and more engaged with how to produce a certain kind of like transformation, social transformation, political transformation. Um, there's that drive to capture people in motion, in a world, if not in crisis, in a state of instability.
Hmm. I think creating film is also about engaging with an audience. And if I'm taking time from people, what is it that I want to say? I use a platform to express myself, yes, but also to express myself on what topic, or what is my perspective on the world around me, and what can I offer positively to that world around me. And films are about narrative as well. So what's the narrative behind the film that I am creating? And even the most spontaneous works, they have to carry some kind of weight or some kind of uh, narrative. It can't be just beautiful images. Or that would be what I would consider a more ephemeral type of work. And it's possible there's some people that do it. It's just not the type of work that I create.
Hmm.
I want to contribute positively to society, and I think filmmaking or media in general is a powerful tool for education, empowerment, and offering some kind of perspective on the world.
Yeah, and I think you can really feel that in the work that you do. And one of the most interesting things I've read that you've said about film is that you think it's often, and I forget exactly where you said this, the most surprising films that get attention.
Mhm.
That element of surprise is interesting, and you seem to really chafe against this kind of this tendency within the art world to try and categorize art. Like these categories obviously are kind of productive in a way. Naming art, abstract, experimental, improvisational, ephemeral, even. But then at a certain point, you clearly resist putting work, as you say, in particular boxes. And I wondered to what extent that is, because I know that you originally studied sociology,
Mhm.
and now there's like a movement away from a certain kind of like academic tendency, I think, to categorize. And many people, like Antonio Viego, has this book Dead Subjects, where he writes that there's an imperative in the academy to make native peoples knowable.
Mhm.
um, is it about trying to like recognize that there is something there that does take away the possibility of surprise on some level?
I'm not sure if I do it intentionally, but
Mm,
I do like to explore the gray zones between categories and borders. I mean,
mm-hmm,
duality in general. I come from two different cultures, and I grew up between French, English, France, Canada, Anishinaabe French. Um, so these dualities are always been present in my work, and I'm also interested with many art forms, so it's been reflected in the work that I do. I like to challenge what is documentary, traditional experimental fiction, narrative films. I like to play with these kind of how would you call that, these languages.
mm-hmm.
Also, genre, is it horror, is it drama, is it 16 millimeter, is it digital? Sometimes I like to mix all of these languages together to create kind of this hybrid form, which feels very personal and feels represents where I'm coming from as an individual. um, so I like to navigate between all these things, and I don't like to be categorized into one thing, because if you do that, you're stopping, you're stagnating. I think it's ebb and flow, and we're constantly moving forward. We're constantly transforming. Each makes you a different person, and we evolve as individuals, as people as well, and as society. And I think that has to be reflected in the work that we do as well.
And I think it makes for much more exciting work just for the viewers of your work. I mean, this is something that like clearly you are playing with the audience's expectations as well. Like from even like these early films that you've done, 360 Degrees, for example, I found to be such a moving documentary. But it is in some ways a kind of more, I guess, modernist or conventional documentary in a certain sense. And then now, moving and trying to play with those forms and induce a kind of element of surprise without, I guess, completely ignoring the viewer, and setting them adrift. Your feature film debut, Bootlegger, for example, I wanted to maybe talk about that a little bit.
Mhm.
You won Best Screenplay at Cannes Cinefondation in 2017. It's now just been picked up by an international distributor.
Yes.
So, I mean, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Um, I'm really interested. So, in terms of So this is a narrative film. This is a film that is not documentary, and so there maybe are certain kind of generic expectations or conventions. But even then, like it's clear that the way that the film is made is unique. It's an autonomous, like it's a film that is about self-representation and self-determination, and it's made with I think crucially a lot of community involvement.
Absolutely, yes.
And people like Houston Wood have written about how this is something that's actually kind of unique to indigenous filmmaking and something that the film industry almost doesn't understand. And for your imaginative keynote, you spoke about the fact that when you can't work with an indigenous crew of filmmakers because it's virtually impossible to assemble one
Mhm.
in the industry, you tend to take on the role of cultural interpreter. I wondered if you could speak to the fundamental ideas behind Bootlegger and why engaging and involving the community in the creative process was a necessary part of that project.
Well, Bootlegger is set into a First Nation community in northern Quebec. So I had to, I mean, it made sense to work with the community and also to work with the community I'm connected to from my maternal family, which is Kirigan-Zibi Anishinaabe, just 2 hours north of Ottawa. But it's an entirely fictionalized story and community. And the film is really exploring, like you said, themes of self-determination, um, wanting to change things and finding your place in society and trying to fit in within that community. Basically, it's the story of a young girl that comes back to her community after many years of not visiting, and she's struggling to find her place. And I guess the only way she can engage is by working, or that because that's how she knows how to contribute. So working and trying to get involved within the community. But it's about dealing with past trauma. It's about finding self determination and just becoming at peace with where you're from and who you are as a person. Um, but I'd like to go back to what you were saying earlier. I don't really think about my audience when I make films. I feel that each film that I made from the very beginning was an exploration of the medium and also of myself. I challenge myself every single time to learn something new, to explore a new avenue or a new way of doing things. So I think that's why I started exploring experimental and then documentary and then flirted with narrative film. And when Bootlegger arrived, it was obviously it's a new challenge because it's a first feature film, but it was also a new challenge because I was going to work with actors prominently, working with community. So it was a new challenge that I knew I would learn so much, and obviously I did. I learned tremendously during that process.
And I can't wait to see the film. I mean, it's going to be so exciting, and it's interesting, like your kind of reflections on the importance of like the medium, the texture of a particular medium. You mentioned I saw you mentioned in a National Post article that the ideas determine the medium in which they are to be expressed,
Mhm.
which was such like interesting way of thinking about it. But some of the work that I've read points out that there has been this kind of resurgence in filmmaking by people who don't necessarily have access to the same kinds of resources, but certain things have kind of freed up the flow of those resources, right? It is now differently possible to gain access to the means of cultural production and share things online, which is
Absolutely.
really exciting.
Yeah. That's the democratization of media as well. I mean, nowadays, almost everyone has a cell phone. Everyone can take pictures, and with making pictures, you can do stop motion animation. You can do videos. You can, start filming your surrounding. You can start talking about your culture. You can do a lot of things with just that medium of a cell phone. DSLR cameras are becoming more accessible as well, sound devices as well. So you can start to create within your own living room, and that's very exciting for what's to come.
Hmm. I think you're right that there is a democratization of media production that is breaking down barriers. But what I really loved about your keynote last year for the Imaginative, festival,
Mhm.
is that you're also engaging with the challenges, the barriers that still exist, and the fact that it is still difficult to surround yourself with other Indigenous filmmakers. You say, I dream of the day when we can do all Indigenous work and the entire production team will be connected to the Indigenous community. And again, so there's this exciting breaking down of barriers, but then there's still your sense is that there's still a lack of resources for Indigenous creatives to actually become professionals in a variety of different fields within cinema, like
Yeah.
sound engineers, editors, and so on. And the thing too is, like, you admit that it's a problem for which you have no immediate solution. But I wanted you, if you could, to speculate on what might need to happen in order to make that possible, like these more demanding fields of narrative cinema to be opened up to more people, to be, as it were, democratized.
I think we definitely need more training, and people need to be aware that getting into the film industry doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a director or producer. There's all these other roles that need to be filled. And maybe the next generation or the youth today, they're not necessarily aware of that you could go into makeup and hair, you could go into set design. Those are really interesting positions to be filled as well, and they're quite creative. And if you're not that creative, you can be, on the technical side. There's so many roles to be filled on a set. And I think that's where we need to educate and we need to train people. And it was difficult to in the making of this first feature film, bringing this entire crew from Montreal into the community, I felt a big responsibility because I was the one bringing them into the community and playing that kind of middleman role, making sure that everything was done with respect, that the crew would understand where they are, that they respect the people from the community, that we're not. This is not our place. We're invited as guests, and we need to be. Our attitude and our actions need to reflect that. But obviously, if you're a crew of 50 people, you can't control everyone's action. So so we also tried to have some mentorship on the crew during the filming, and that was also quite a difficult part because I was filming in French and the crew was mostly francophone, and where we were filming it was mostly anglophone. So there was some kind of language barrier as well. And I think the Indigenous Anglophone community has maybe a little bit more resources than the Francophone community, because I did look here in Quebec to hire Indigenous key creatives, such as the camera person, the sound guy, and I looked really hard. And at one point, yes, you can hire those individuals that maybe have a little bit of experience, but when you're doing a feature film, and I'm already unexperienced because it's my first feature film, you need to have people that can support you also in those roles, right? So sometimes it's a matter of, do you go with an experienced person that is not from your community, or do you go with someone that doesn't have the experience but is from your community? So sometimes it's a difficult decision to make.
It sounds extremely hard, and it sounds as though, as you said at the beginning of the conversation, like that you needed this break to some extent just to catch your breath. And these are all responsibilities you're describing that are in excess of actually, like, the creative process of making the film. So that sounds extremely difficult. You mentioned the language barrier. Something that you talk about is this kind of, and I wanted you to elaborate on this concept that Indigenous people in Quebec face a kind of double solitude,
Hmm.
an additional level of marginalization, something that I don't think in Anglophone Canada people are even aware of. Like, it's not on their radar. This kind of gap between Indigenous Anglophone and Francophone communities. There are, as you say, 11 nations in Quebec. Many don't speak English. Having that language barrier at the societal level means not being able to access key resources and tools that are available elsewhere. I'm not bilingual. I didn't have an awareness of these kinds of issues until I saw you speak. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on that idea of like a double solitude.
Well, most often for Indigenous communities in Quebec, English is their third language. So,
Hmm.
can you imagine the amount of people that only speak one language in Canada, let alone having to learn three languages? It's a lot, you know?
Hmm.
And I guess within the film industry, most of the Indigenous film industry is rooted in Anglophone speaking industry. And for so which means that francophones, indigenous francophones in Quebec don't necessarily have access to all the resources, the tools that is available nationwide or even international wide, because the Maoris, the Samis, the South African, um, they all have this common international language that is English. So that means just being able to access training or keynotes online, or going to Imaginative, which is the biggest Indigenous film festival in the world, but based in Toronto. Every industry and professional meetings and networking event happen in English. So what do you do when the language barrier is there? So you can't promote your film, you can't promote your work, you can't make connections to make your next film, and that already blocks opportunities to keep advancing your career or advancing just getting your projects done. Which means that we become insular. We stay in Quebec and we create work that are going to be made in French that very often don't make it outside of Quebec because they're not necessarily translated into English. So we start making work for ourselves by ourselves, which is not a bad thing in itself. But how do you branch out to being able to access bigger platforms and getting your work recognized?
And I know you've talked about how you've kind of worked as a liaison almost for creatives, like offering the work of kind of translating maybe grant proposals and these kinds of things. The thing, though, that does seem to have been democratized first is documentary. There's something much more sort of open about that particular mode of communication. Documentary. It's more. It just seems like it's more germane to forms of like experimentation and new voices.
Right.
And I originally discovered your work through the National Film Board website, an aggregated list of films that warrant attention. And you talk about how the National Film Board plays a major role and has been proactive in catching up. It has this kind of long history that a bit of a head start on this kind of work of, if not inclusion, more like distribution or democratization. Um, and I kind of wanted to use this as a way of thinking through what I guess is to some extent a breakout film for you, Mobilize,
Hmm.
which has made a huge impact. This is a film that actually uses segments from National Film Board films, in particular the 1965 documentary High Steel.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just this incredible text that my students were absolutely floored by, and it's crazy to me to think that you were given 1 week to complete this film.
I was
How did it
given
come
1 month,
together?
1 month to
Oh,
complete.
1 month.
Yeah.
Maybe that was misreported in an article that I read.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
I
couldn't
had
believe the
one
one.
week to find the concept though, so it was
Yeah.
it was a very fast-paced film, and I think that's why you can feel that urgency in the film. It's very
Hmm.
fast-paced and it puts you out of breath, and it was the intention. It was I think
Hmm.
every work that I make kind of reflects also where I'm at in a particular moment in time as a person.
Hmm. And you're kind of straining creatively to construct something that does have this kind of force. I know you started with Tanya Tagaq's song and then tried to piece it together from there, but the film as a whole doesn't, many critics have noted it doesn't explicitly state its in the way that another filmmaker might, kind of documentary purpose or message. It really, and you talk about how this is often your way of operating as an artist is not necessarily to say, like Glenn Coulthard has this book Red Skin White Mask, where he talks about native migration to urban centers over the last few decades, and it's a deeply academic book that provides you with a certain kind of glimpse into how industrialization, resource exploitation, all of these things are creating a kind of like reconfiguring
Hmm.
of life. But rather than like explicitly say all of that through like voiceover and so on, there's something that does the work that is much more abstract and I guess experimental, but more like associative.
Hmm.
And so I guess I wanted to ask you about the way that you approach conveying a certain kind of like emotional import in your work. Like you say, you try not to spoon feed the audience. You like to leave it abstract. And I guess rather than asking you why abstraction as a whole is important, which is almost like a meaningless question, I more am curious about that desire to inspire an emotional reaction. Is it about, like, Rebecca Thomas is a Mi'kmaq poet here in Halifax, and she talks about how her poetry is about trying to use emotion to actually overcome certain entrenched ways of thinking about the division between the kind of borders, as you say, between cultures and communities, and the kinds, like overcoming people's personal attachments to histories, ways of knowing the world. Like, is that the whole kind of function of emotion for you, is to kind of overwhelm all of those things that really like
Hmm.
constitute us somehow as people?
I do really appreciate when a work can be emotionally charged and can speak for itself, and where audiences can each feel whatever they want to feel. And I think that's why I don't like to spoon feed people, because it's interesting to see how audiences react to a work, and people can react in very different ways. And I think that's where it becomes very beautiful, is that you take it as your own personal experience, and everyone has a very different um, individual experience towards the work.
So, and I thought we could maybe connect this to, I think one of your most recent pieces, is it titled Transatlantic,
Yes.
which is this, again, like overwhelming video installation.
This Yes, this one is an installation at the Broad Museum in Michigan State right now. It's an installation, but the original installation was titled Like Ships in the Night,
Right.
and it was presented at the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Center for the Arts.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think this work is probably the most sensory, emotional piece that I've done, where I really want audiences to be able to reflect and feel what they want and see what they want. I'm proposing images. I'm proposing a voyage, a journey, but everyone's journey is different. And yeah, that was the intention behind the work.
Hmm. And it's funny that you used the verb proposing, right? There is again this like a not instrumental, not necessarily, very sort of heavy-handed. It's a much more open-ended, yeah, proposal to the audience to, immerse themselves in this journey that you took across the Atlantic. And it's funny that even viewing it on YouTube is it still has. I can't even imagine experiencing it firsthand. This kind of this attempt at mediating in an immediate way that colonial route. It's so absorbing, and it reminded me honestly of a documentary that I watched on Greta Thunberg,
Hmm.
I Am Greta,
Mhm.
where this now famous journey that she makes across the Atlantic on a sailboat is depicted as this absolutely excruciating thing. And you really do feel her nausea, but you feel it in part because she is describing it to you.
Mhm.
And that's maybe the difference when it comes to the installation that you created, is that it's left up to the audience to decode the kinds of emotional, impacts that this journey had on you. So it's absolutely incredible. I hope people, sort of check it out, at least online, if
Yeah.
they can.
It's a large scale video, so it intended to be an immersive experience. And although I don't put any words to it, I do purposely invite you to go through a series of emotions, and that can be, boredom or serenity, or also nausea, because I do have this part where it's going very fast and it's very tumultuous, and so hoping people do experience it in some ways.
Hmm. I guess I want to make sure that I attend to as much of your work as possible. In an interview with Criterion for your short film, The Black Case,
Hmm.
um, you talk about landscape. Like you're asked about the function of the landscape, where it was shot, and these kinds of things. And we could talk more broadly about The Black Case, which you've said has been, despite dwelling with the reality of residential schools, it's been met with a very receptive audience, right? Like it hasn't. Well, you talk about being afraid of the kind of impact the film was going to make because it is so disturbing and deals with trauma.
Yes.
The gothic imagery of the opening, the kinds of black and white cinematography in the film, it's all meant to kind of key the audience again, emotionally, into a specific relationship with the landscape. And I think that's why Criterion was so interested in asking you about that.
Hmm.
And I guess I wondered if you could expand in some ways on the story behind that particular film, how you maybe found that location, and why that location felt emotionally, I guess, like the right space in which to construct this film.
Well, the story is based on a true story. So it's actually my partner's grandmother, who the voice we hear at the end, it's her story.
Mm,
She's a residential school survivor, and I remember many years ago, she told me the story that she didn't like black case, and she didn't like babies crying, and the reason why is because she remembers a doctor putting a a dead baby in a black case. And for me, it was such a horrific story, that you would only see in a horror flick,
hmm
so that's why I think the movie was accessible to audiences, because we decided to make it as a horror movie and to use that genre to make it more accessible for broader audiences, to speak about something as terrible as residential schools, but also not to point the finger at it, because I think sometimes when you talk about residential schools, some people will shut down. They don't want to hear about it. They've heard too much of it, or so it was a way for us to use the genre and of filmmaking to talk about it in a larger sense.
hmm
And then, of course, this woman, she lives in Manitoba. So the story was based from the prairies, but me being based in Montreal, we tried to film it here, and so we went to Oka, and Oka has this monastery. I think that's the word,
hmm
monastery. And it felt just the perfect place to do it, because it has also, a history, and it relates to the story, and just the black and white images allows us to not fall into nostalgia, to make it a timeless piece, even though in the movie you can tell it's kind of a period piece, but just to make it that it's not nostalgic, that you can feel that it's still very present today.
hmm and that sort of allergy to nostalgia is something that kind of runs through your work in a way that I find really interesting. You are dedicated to this kind of like escape velocity that's it is seeking a way out of, just as you say, like cycles of shame and abuse and victimization. And clearly, you're using art to kind of accelerate toward that future.
Hmm.
And I find that so, yeah, I wanted to maybe speak with you about that, and that sort of like how that comes with a certain kind of like tempered resistance to nostalgia, because on the one hand, um, we can sort of speak to the ways in which a certain kind of like traditional knowledge can serve the project or process of decolonization, and recovering and relearning identity and so on. But what you're talking about too is how a certain kind of nostalgia can almost, if not romanticize the tragedy of colonialism or colonial violence, reproduce a certain kind of cycle of victimization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I mean, like, there's so many films, like your film, Kawoni is a perfect illustration of that kind of drive for a language of indigenous resilience that doesn't just like rest on easy ideas of just victimization. There's this
Mm-hmm.
really, multifaceted discussion of the effects of colonialism, in producing violence within certain communities. But it's always about sort of trying to find a way out. And Tashina, for example, is about trying to find that way out through education. There is, it seems, a certain desire a desire for liberation. And do you think of it in those kind of like explicitly political terms, or is it more akin to like Leanne Simpson's idea of a kind of decolonial ethic of love? She talks in the book Islands of Decolonial Love about
Mm-hmm.
trying to animate beings in the contact zone. Like, is it about that kind of love as medicine thing, or is it more explicitly about like a political liberation for you?
I would say more political
Mm,
liberation. I think when I started making work in the first place, it was to counter feelings of shame and trauma, and really just finding a way to regain some self confidence. And through making works, I was finding this self confidence and bringing positive stories to the screen. I always wanted to celebrate the positive. What is it we're doing that is positive instead of focusing on the negative? And that's always been very, very important. And the more I'm making the work, I think that the more I really nurture that. It's about what are the stories that can inspire rather than pointing at the finger something. You can bring those underlying issues and talk about them, but talk about them through a personal kind of uh, self-involvement, or through a personal journey or personal growth.
mhm.
So every film has been kind of centered around that.
And it really it brings the viewer in. There's a way in which it does provide a certain kind of corrective to maybe stereotypical ways that, in particular, Indigenous folks have been represented, I think, in Canada. Tayaki Alfred talks about this kind of renewal of respect for traditional values, not just as something that relegates Indigenous communities to like a place permanently in the past,
Hmm.
but that can actually offer a solution to the political, economic, and social problems that plague the world at large. Like that to me is part of the part of the point of these kinds of artistic texts is to mobilize, right? To mobilize people to desire democracy, to desire self determination.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I try as much as possible to make the work modern and contemporary. I'm not
Mm,
interested necessarily of making works that are based in the past, or that has this nostalgic feeling to it. For me, it has to reflect the times we live in today, and the issues and conversation I hear with my friends and my peers. What we talk about, what concerns we have, um, and also reflect my urban also reality, and the things that I'm attracted to and attached to, and the visual language and the sounds for me need to be modern and feel very set today.
mm. Um, And even, I wanted to ask about the kind of specific materials that you use, in terms of using, making the work that you do feel modern and contemporary and concerned about contemporary kinds of social and political questions. You're also choosing stuff to work with that is, actually both traditional and contemporary and industrial, right? So you talk about the piece Shield, which
Hmm.
is a series of 11 concrete triangles, and the fact that copper is this traditional material. I didn't realize it, but it can symbolize femininity,
Hmm.
um, you know. But it's also a deeply destructive, industrial material, right? There's Lauren Redness has this book about Oak Flat in the United States as a site of potential copper extraction.
Right.
Um, so, like, your work really, it bridges again. It does this work of bridging the traditional and the contemporary moment of hyper extractivism, where these industrial materials, I mean, cement, concrete accounts for like 10% of the greenhouse gases that we emit every year or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
That's
So you're working with these materials in a way that I wonder if there's like a conscious attempt to subvert even our relationship to the stuff itself that is so characteristic of like a hyper extractivist settler culture. Do you think about that when you choose these
yes.
types of materials?
Definitely, every medium that I work with, every material I work with, does need to have some kind of symbolism or represent something and be part of the narrative that I'm trying to express. I work with a lot of different layers of meaning through the work, and this copper pipe going through cement blocks, for me, it speaks about the resilience of indigenous communities or indigenous people throughout centuries, throughout the times. The copper pipe is symbolic of this traditional material. It has it's part of kind of a royal material, and it's linking each of these blocks as kind of a DNA, um, as part of our DNA. So I was saying that maybe resilience is part of our DNA. Um,
Hmm.
we've been built that way over the years.
Yeah, it's a really stunning piece, and I loved seeing you kind of speak to it. And on Instagram, I've noticed too that you're producing these highly abstract pieces of embroidery out of Tivek. Is that how it's pronounced? This industrial material, Tivek?
Tyvek, yes.
Tyvek, sorry.
That's what you'd see
Um,
on everyone's houses before
right.
they finish the outside. Yeah.
And this is like another example of something that can be quite a toxic material. Apparently, building our houses with this Tyvek, it doesn't make for safer houses. Like, they can burn up faster, apparently.
Yeah.
But you're turning it into a bright canvas for abstraction. And again, it feels like you're almost subverting these industrial materials.
I'm using materials that I can find in my immediate surrounding, and
Ah.
that means going to my local hardware store and playing with these textures and materials. But I do want to bring some kind of attention to the indigenous housing crisis and the way we build our houses, and what is our impact on the environment. Um, all the work is aiming towards that for sure. And by using these materials, people might not see it at first glance, but when you start reading about the work, that's when dialogue can open up, and
Mhm.
that then those issues can rise up. I mean, I strongly believe you can't possess the earth, and that we need to be careful about our impact on it. And using these building materials that are really basic made, uh, there's no vision for it for the future. They don't disintegrate.
Mhm.
Often they're cheap materials that are being left on the land to just stay there for years, and they create a lot of damage. So to use them to alter them, to use them in a different way, I'm hoping to that we can they become very apparent, so they're not just something that we hide and think that we're not using. and bringing it back to common knowledge that this is everywhere around us.
Yeah, and exactly like that thing of just making it visible. The black case begins with this epigraph. Part of our history is buried under silence. Like there's so much power that gets perpetuated just by concealment alone. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't want to take too much more of your time. It's been so great talking to you, but I did want to maybe conclude by again coming back to the film 360 Degrees, which I don't know how often you've thought about this film recently, but I have to think that in the context of this pandemic, a film that does think through a different relationship, not just to the land, but to medicine, to the health of bodies, could have a certain kind of relevance right now. It's an incredibly moving film that is slow and it's subtle. It shows the transmission of traditional knowledge through just interaction. Um, but these ideas that are presented so subtly in the film about using plants to help the body regenerate offer a kind of corrective to the way that we're currently thinking about medicine, I think, which is, we need privately controlled Western medicine to like save us from this crisis.
Hmm.
Instead, like you have a different model presented, which I mean, like we're seeing the fact that in the context of COVID-19, that model of medicine that sees solutions as primarily the intellectual property of corporations is not going to save us. Like
Yeah.
you're preventing people from sharing information in the way that Mark in the film shares information, right?
Yeah, and these it's funny you bring back this film up because it's a film I rarely talk about and actually often don't include it in my filmography.
Hmm.
But it's interesting because these elders, Mark and many other elders, were talking about a pandemic coming years ago. This film was made, I think, in 2008. So that's a long time ago that we were already discussing this idea of we would be living a pandemic in this day and age. So
Hmm.
I think these are not new ideas or new concerns. We do know that the rapid, fast lifestyle that we have is not sustainable, and it will have a deep impact on humanity and the earth and the world. And we need to start going back to what is important and finding new ways of doing things. And learning about traditional medicine. I mean, everything is available for us already in our surrounding. The world is really beautifully made. Everything is there for us. And I think, obviously, traditionally, First Nation communities have understood that, and it's a knowledge that we need to continue sharing and across generations. But it's also we need to be careful to not share it to pharmaceutical companies that
Hmm.
will not respect the intellectual property.
And so like the film really stuck with me, and in particular this line that Mark says, and it's just dropped in again, kind of just an invitation to thought, where he says the task at hand is vast. Like
Hmm.
that is a very profound statement, and one that I kept thinking about. Like, is he talking about the challenge of like the kind of intended meaning seems to be that there is a real challenge to having to heal others, like that role is leads, he says, to his own kind of health being jeopardized, right? Like he gets burnt out from just having to treat people, and you're seeing that today with like the medical profession, the health professionals, having to actually deal with, in the United States, 500,000 people dying from the coronavirus, like absolutely overwhelmed ERs. I mean, the system of Western medicine is clearly being exposed as something that is not capable of sustaining life.
I do agree that the task is vast, and we see all these, environmental um, uh, militant, being burnt out by the work task, the work they're doing, and they're giving their all, and it takes a lot of energy, and because there's another side of people and society that doesn't listen and doesn't change their ways. So when only a few people are doing the work, of course they're going to be burnt out.
I don't want to take any more of your time, but it's been wonderful talking to you. Your work is so insightful. Hearing you talk about it is really wonderful. Yeah, it's been so fun.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure.